Hi, I'm Lily. I'm the Youth and Children's Minister here at St. Mark's, if you don't know me. That's why I've been running around giving clipboards to the kids. This sermon has nothing to do with children. I just wanted to introduce myself. Author Jamie Anderson says that grief is love with nowhere to go, which I think is a beautiful framing, and it's one I've returned to more than once in my own life. But if I'm honest, in my experience, it goes more like this. Grief is what you feel when there's nothing left to do. I didn't come by this understanding on my own. I come to very few understandings on my own. When I first started getting treatment for my mental health, the therapist I worked with told me this. She said, "You have to learn when to grieve." Not how, I don't think I was there yet, but when. I had to identify when grief was an appropriate response. Because I was stuck in a lot of situations where I was just trying to fix or change things that were out of my control. I was trapped in this mindset of if I could just, which is one word in my brain, if I could just. But she taught me that there was a time and a place to recognize that this is sad. It's unfair. I wish it wasn't like this. And that's it. There's no next step. There's no action item to take. I just had to learn to sit with the sad, the unfair, the wish it wasn't. That's grief. It's no accident that in the stages of grief, which are more like a tangling cycle than neat steps to ascend through, the so-called final stage is said to be acceptance. Acceptance is also a key part of the Serenity Prayer, as we all work to accept the things we cannot change, and to gain the wisdom to understand what those actually are. And what is death, if not the ultimate challenge to our if I could just? It's that one thing we simply cannot change. And I do not pretend to know why this life, this world, this reality that God has created for us includes death. But I sure can't deny that it does. And despite my constant tilting toward that state of if I could just, there is no amount of striving or strategizing that can change death. The reality of death is not a gentle invitation to acceptance. It forces us, painfully and horribly, but undeniably, to a place where all we can do is sit with its unchangeability and our own powerlessness in the face of something so irreversible and inevitable. For me, learning when to grieve was key to finding a way to live. I don't think I could have accepted a gentle invitation, but living in a world where death, that of those I love and my own, stands as a monument to all that I cannot change, and it gives me no other option. And even when it comes to situations that don't involve the literal death of a body, but maybe the death of a relationship or a specific vision of the future, I have the model of grief to help me understand that sometimes there is nothing for me to do, only a feeling to sit with. To sit with. I'm using that phrase on purpose because of the next story I'm about to tell. A few months ago, the last time I preached, I walked everybody through a guided meditation. It was a version that I do with the kids quite frequently, but I oomphed it up for the grown-ups. And if you don't remember, if you weren't here, what it does is it has us bring all sorts of thoughts and feelings that we absolutely do not want to sit with, things like anger and fear and despair and anxiety. And for the grown-up version I wrote, I did include grief. We call those all into our minds and our bodies, and at the end of the meditation, we use our breath and our imaginations to blast it all away from us, leaving us floating in this peaceful space left behind. And after leading this, I got some feedback from a really good friend of mine here. And this person had recently navigated the loss of more than one beloved family member. And they told me that while they appreciated the exercise in general, when I listed grief as one of those things that we would send away from ourselves in order to find rest in God's presence, they weren't into that. To them, their grief was something precious and tender, part of their memory, their honoring their loved ones. It was not something they wanted to get rid of or reject. And this hit me. It was powerful feedback. It wasn't something I had even considered when writing the meditation. Because if grief is love with nowhere to go, then of course we would want to hold that love close, not see it as something that separates us from God's peaceful presence. But if grief represents a sense of defeated helplessness, then it makes a little more sense to want to it away. So I sat with that. I had to really think about why I had included grief in that meditation and what it meant for me to use prayer and meditation as a way of not feeling it. Is this feeling of I can't do anything about this really a place of rest for me? Or is it something standing between me and rest? And who really was I to get up and talk to this community, one full of people who have faced all sorts of losses, some of which may echo my own story, and some of which I could never even imagine? And then I got asked to preach on All Souls and All Saints. So I kept thinking about how the last time I preached, I'd brought up grief, and maybe I'd gotten it wrong, or I'd missed the point, or I just mistook my own perspective for something everyone needed. And then I looked at today's verses, and I saw that same strange tension that I'd been wrestling with, how grief can include both helpless, frustrated rage, as well as acceptance and rest in God's presence. In our scripture today, we read, "Their departure was thought to be a disaster, and their going from us to be their destruction. But," there's that turn word, "but they are at peace." It doesn't say we are at peace, those who are left grieving. It says they. There's that recognition of the pain and the misery. And then there's that but that points us back to God's peace. And our verse from Revelation today mentions death, tears, mourning, crying, and pain. And then comes the promise that all things will be made new, that God recognizes and is present in the pain and speaking peace and healing over it. And then there's our gospel story today. It's a familiar one, but the details always stand out no matter how many times I come back to it. Mary, her anger and confusion. Jesus, if you were here, he would not have died. The crowd's accusation and frustration. How is it that you have such power, but we still see death and loss all around us? And even though Jesus knows how the story ends, and he knows what God can do, and he is confident in that power, he weeps alongside them. He is moved. He is disturbed. He doesn't get defensive. He doesn't lean on trite phrases like, God has a plan, or heaven need another angel. He just shows up, sits with them, walks with them, weeps with them. And then he raises Lazarus, but not before saying this: God, I knew that you always hear me. Jesus speaks God's presence, even in the midst of grief. He hears the pain all around him, and he responds with a clear statement that God, too, is hearing it. So I've been thinking a lot about grief and what it means and what I can say about it. I've been writing this sermon, and I've been planning the programming for the Altar of Remembrance we'll do after the service today. How do I lead children and families through rituals and traditions around grief in a way that makes any sense, especially when I'm still working to even pin down my own understanding of grief? Because when I really think about it, I did mean to include grief in that meditation. It wasn't an accident. I wasn't just trying to use a fancy grown-up word for feeling sad. But what was I identifying as grief in the sense of something I wanted God's help to lift up away from me? It wasn't the memories of beloved friends and family who I miss. It wasn't the stillness I find in accepting that some things are out of my control. It was whatever happens in me when I hear that we're losing old-growth Amazon rainforest at a rate of more than a football field a minute. When profit-driven misinformation convinces someone I grew up with to hate people like me. When I see the death toll for children in Gaza rise over 10,000. When a broken, under-resourced foster care system takes a child I love from my home into an unsafe situation. That's grief, too. But it doesn't really feel like love with nowhere to go. There is no peace in my sense of powerlessness there. And I don't know what to do. Forget learning when to grieve. At this point, sometimes it feels like every day is a new opportunity to face down something unfair, something terribly sad, something that makes all of our "if I could just" tense without any release. Do any of us know how to truly grieve in this time? In a world that gives us a constant litany of things to grieve, but few tools to accept or change any of it? Is there a prayer that can truly help us get words around this? So I just come back to Christ's words. God, I know that you always hear me. You have blessed us with a scripture that does not turn away from but gives words to our sense of disaster, despair, mourning. When those come up in our scriptures today, the crying, the grieving, we also hear that God dwells with us, watches over us. The promise is not that we will never grieve, but that God will be with us in our grief. That's the faith we will claim a little later in our service, in the words of the baptism. God's presence with us, God walking with us through this journey. So we light candles, we decorate altars, we say prayers, we baptize babies. We lean into the rituals and traditions handed down to us. We write meditations and we get feedback on them and we work on it. We learn how and when to grieve, and when we can't, we come together here to keep figuring it out. That's the promise we're going to make to Nora later on. Not that she will never grieve, but that we will be with her when she does. That we claim that promise and that faith of God's continued presence. Like Jesus in today's gospel, and like the dichotomies in today's scriptures, we all will walk that strange balance between pain and promise, between anger and acceptance. Is grief love with nowhere to go? Is it a cosmic reminder that ultimately we're not in control? Is it just a bunch of messy, uncomfortable feelings? I don't know. All I know is it's something God hears. Grief is somewhere God is present, where Jesus stands and weeps with us. What is grief? Grief is heard. That's what I've got. When it comes to everything we remember on All Saints and All Souls days, the people who've come before us, the things we still want to do, the things we can change, the things we can't. Sometimes I feel anger and despair. Sometimes I feel helpless rage. Sometimes I feel a peaceful resignation. Sometimes I rejoice in the memories and blessings of those I miss. Sometimes I just want to blast it all away from me. I don't know that there's one right way to do this. If there is, I haven't found it. But what I know, what I hear, is that no matter what our grief sounds like, God hears it.